This is Matthias Rast. As an 18-year-old with 15 hours flight experience, in 1987, he flew a little plane from Germany and almost landed on the Kremlin. He couldn't quite do it and touched down on a bridge by St. Basil's Cathedral. This was profoundly embarrassing for the Soviet Union. It was unbelievable that the Soviet military did not stop him. But now, as the Kremlin was on fire in the night.
Drone strike at the Kremlin.
Strike Russian President Vlad.
That same sense of awkwardness and embarrassment for the Putin regime returns. Now we have to look at the vital and surprising political takeaways. But before we do that, we've got to ask the basic question: who done it? Let's start with Ukraine did it, which is the most plausible explanation until we know more. This was not an assassination attempt on Putin. Mr. Putin doesn't live in the Kremlin. He is not there at night. So this is about symbolism. This is about politics. And this sends a very powerful message, even though it practically doesn't accomplish any goals. If this wasn't Ukraine, Ukraine is perfectly capable in the future of carrying out similar operations. What Ukraine does on Russian soil, as we'll hear in a moment, will continue to diversify and escalate in 2023. Now let's look at the Kremlin done it as a false flag operation. Now, it's not going to help Russia in Ukraine because Russia is bombarding Ukraine at capacity for months and months and months. Russia has been trying to kill Zelensky for months and months and months and almost got there in the first week or two of the war. And Russia is not planning a nuclear strike on Ukraine. We're going to look momentarily at the domestic repercussions of this. But actually, if this were a Russian false flag operation, the most powerful reason for it would be to dispirit Western citizens from supporting Ukraine by making them feel that the war is getting out of hand. So this is about getting you guys to get tired with sustained and escalating support for Ukraine. This would be the main reason. Our first takeaway is that inevitably, as we've discussed many times on the main channel and on the chat channel, the war will be coming over onto Russian soil. You can't bombard a country that you have brutally invaded for no legitimate reason and think that that's not going to come back to you. Of course it will, and it'll keep happening increasingly. And this may well not be the last Kremlin bombing we see. Ukraine will be conducting operations on Russian soil. Russians coming back from the front with military experience are going to create concoctions of violence on Russian soil. Mr. Putin unwinding, letting go of the monopoly over organized violence on Russian territory by having the Chechen gang, by having the Wagner gang, by having a specially localized army where folks feel accountable to their local commanders and not centrally. All of that is potentially ripe for violence on Russian soil. So this is going to be happening again and again and again and again, both from Ukraine and from, if you like, the latent components of a civil war coming to materialize more and more in Russia. Putin's main opposition aren't the pro-democracy folks. It's actually the case that in 2023, the main opposition Putin faces will be radicals who want not war, but victory. It's really unnatural to get your head around it because you think this is an awful tyrant. Surely eventually he'll get overthrown and there'll be enough people wanting a democratic alternative. Well, that might be a medium-term possibility, but short-term, there is no prospect of any kind of democratic upheaval in Russia. The real prospect is that Mr. Putin is going to face harder and harder opposition from the radicals who want a more successful war. He's going to have to accommodate their demands, accommodate their discourse, and accommodate their expectations. He's going to be ceding power increasingly to them and their discourse and becoming a hostage of it. And incidents like this implicate him just that little bit further in that anyway inevitable dynamic. Mass terror is not just plausible in the medium-term future in Russia. It's little by little where the country is moving. At the moment, political persecution is about tens of thousands, but it's not implausible for that to dramatically multiply. What will drive this Stalinization of the Putin regime, even though that's not quite the right word, because we know that Putin resembles 1930s European fascism more than he does Soviet communism. But mass arrests and executions were a feature of the Stalin period, and so that's why we make that reference. This will simply be contingent on Putin's sense of threat, the threat that his regime experiences and the threat that he perceives his regime experiences. There are two levels of threat. One is threat to regime security, am I going to lose power? And the second is threat to the sustenance of Russia as an imperial power. So when Putin says, this threatens us, that threatens us, you expanded that and this, and we are very threatened, what he means is not that that necessarily threatens Russia. It rather means it threatens Russia as he understands it, and that is Russia as an imperial power. And the bombing of the Kremlin does not dramatically change this, but it gives an infinitesimal acceleration to that momentum. Let's look at the implications for Russian propaganda. We know that Russian propaganda is different to Soviet propaganda, which was alternate reality propaganda. Soviet propaganda said there is an alternative picture of the universe and you've got to believe in it. And even if you don't, at least pretend you believe in it. But Russian propaganda has a postmodern quality. It doesn't say believe in this. It says doubt that there's a way to work anything out at all. Doubt that anything is true. Even doubt the propaganda message itself, so long as you also doubt what everybody else is telling you. The result of that has got to be irony and apathy. But here is what's important. In the last few months, this has been changing, and Russian propaganda has been moving back to Soviet-style propaganda. Today, it's about 80% postmodern Russian propaganda, which is what was 100% when the war started, but it's 20% Soviet-style propaganda now, because there is actually an objective truth that is being little by little increasingly introduced to the Russian population. And that truth is we're embarking on a large-scale war, perhaps in the late 2020s, against the West, and we've got to get ready for it. And this bombing of the Kremlin will contribute a little bit to that transformation. And now we've got to come to the takeaway about how this will impact the Russian population, who are preponderantly a population, not citizens. They are depoliticized. So what does that mean? It means that, yes, there is a clear pro-war demographic, and that makes about 20% of the population. There is a clear anti-war demographic, perhaps also 20% of the population. But the 50 or 60 blob in the middle are depoliticized. They're people who have outsourced politics to the Kremlin. They have exchanged, as often happens in the kind of authoritarian regime that early Putinism was, it often happens that people give away their public freedom in exchange for their private freedom. The regime's coming for their private freedom too now, but it's too late. And the problem these folks in the middle have got is that they can't face what a catastrophe this deal has landed them into. And the sheer catastrophe of where their apathy has led them, right, is so hard to face that actually a Kremlin on fire is for now going to make these people turn away more rather than get engaged. They're going to retreat even further and say, I am here in my shell and I don't want to have anything to do with this. But the more anxious they get and the more they defensively retreat, the more likely it is that eventually some of them are going to snap and materialize from being apolitical, a population, into being citizens. But how did this depoliticized blob end up in this situation? What's the history? Why did this happen? To learn about all of this, watch this video next.